So the Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, has appealed to the British public for the return of the Parthenon Marbles. Um, he's vowed to use every means in its quest to persuade London to relinquish the Parthenon sculptures with a campaign that will focus on winning over the hearts and minds of Britons. Yeah, I'm not really sure where I stand on this. There was a time for a number of years where I thought we should definitely keep them. Then I read some story about how the British Museum was sort of badly. Uh, the building itself was in bad condition, and there'd been a leak after a rainstorm, and rain had sort of leaked onto the sculptures themselves, or something like that, thus damaging them slightly.
Yeah, that would be one of the arguments, because one of the arguments has consistently been for keeping things in the British Museum. Yes, but if we sent them back to Timbuktu or whatever it is we got them from, they would just be, they wouldn't be looked after by the people there because they have not got the capacity to look after them. And that, to be honest, it outraged all the right people, but it is true in a large number of cases. You don't, it's just a fact that if you're sending something to the Democratic Republic of Congo, the standards of museum upkeep in the Democratic Republic of Congo are not very high. But if that is the case, and the British Museum is itself sort of crumbling at the seams, well, there is a very fascinating and fantastic and almost brand new museum built around the Parthenon now, which is state of the art, very high tech. Greece is not, despite what the best efforts of the European Union, Greece is not a third world country, and it would absolutely take care of them. So that, there are many arguments for and against this. That would be one of the arguments that I don't think holds very well anymore, given that the Greeks have put a lot of effort into this.
Yeah, another argument which Brian Sewell, in an essay, one of the essays in his Orwell Prize-winning collection of essays a number of years ago now, said that it makes no sense to return them to Greece, because the Greeks in Greece now are no longer really Greek. So it's kind of an ethnic argument. If the Greeks living in Greece at the moment are nothing like the Greeks who founded who built the sculptures themselves. But again, this kind of makes no sense. Well, even if that were true, it still wouldn't. It's not the ethnicity of the Greeks that are at question, that's at stake here. It's in what setting are they most fitting, these sculptures?
Well, it's that, and it's also, but there's also the question of
still
culture
exists.
and the history of culture and the
a
continuity
replica.
of culture. The ethnic argument is just, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. I mean, okay, well, in several important respects, the British, who created so much that we made throughout our medieval period, and prior to that, are not the same British. If, for instance, hypothetically, the Chinese were to invade and expropriate Stonehenge, would you accept it as a British person if the Chinese turned around and said, "Oh well, yes, but the British now aren't the British who erected Stonehenge, so it's not really theirs anymore"?
No, of course not. And yeah, so I think I disagree with that argument now. Whereas once as I say, once I thought maybe we should keep them. I went to an Intelligence Squared debate, actually, about the Parthenon, or dare I say Elgin marbles, some years ago, and there were good arguments on both sides, and I still think there are good arguments to keep them. But the thing is, there are every year now, there are huge numbers of claims from various nation states to the British Museum to give back this or that supposedly all important cultural artifact, because we stole a lot of things.
I think the Ethiopians
but
are currently lodging a request along those
well,
lines.
fair play to them, because the Ethiopian empire, or not empire, as a civilization, before and after its Christianization, was a beautiful and mighty and delicate and culturally refined thing. But we focus on the Parthenon marbles because of their symbolic power in the context of Western civilization. I suspect that's why they get as much attention as they do, as opposed to any of the other artifacts that we could be discussing.
And I just think, because
so in a way, they are symbolic of all the rest.
Christopher Hitchens did a debate on this, arguing for their return to Greece, and I distinctly remember one of his arguments being that, of course, the return of the marbles to Greece and the statues to Greece would not be the start of a slippery slope, because there is no evidence, he said at the time, and it may well have been true at the time, that there were a whole host of third world countries queuing up to make the equivalent demands. I don't think
Which there
time has
now are.
been time has not been very kind to that pronouncement, I don't think.
Yeah, and it does raise the interesting question of whether this would set a precedent. I mean, certainly it would in many people's minds, but whether it does formally, logically speaking, I don't know. I mean, it's
It
hard
would
to
be
see
hard.
how
You
it
can see how it
wouldn't.
would be harder, yeah. Even if it's
Yeah.
not a legal precedent, you can see how it would be very harder for the British Museum to resist subsequent calls from others. But they're not even subsequent calls, because they're being made almost daily now by various different countries. I don't know. I think I can still see an argument for returning the Elgin marbles, which does not apply to artifacts from Ethiopia, for instance, or other countries, which is that in a very real sense, the bulk of these artworks and these statues and the rest still exists and is a defining aspect of the Greek sense of their own history. It's not that they've lost the history entirely and become a completely different people, and they're looking to the sole surviving remnants of an old culture and saying, well, we want that back. That's not the case, because the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum are famously sections of statue. They're sections of panel work. They're sections of art, which were just sort of very arbitrarily and not with a great deal of care or talent, just extracted from the Parthenon itself, which still stands. And
Yeah,
so
to
you get
repeat, the
the
Parthenon
upper
still
body.
stands more
The
or less.
Parthenon still stands. The upper body of Zeus is in London, and his arse and his legs are in Greece. The head of a horse is in Greece, and its body is in London.
I
So
suppose it would
it
be
would be a
crass of
sense
me
of
to say that the Greeks are only really interested in the arse and the legs, to judge by Greek mythology.
oh, I don't know. I think that there's what's in front of the legs matters too. But no, but so that there is this argument from sort of artistic or narrative completeness, I think, which applies almost uniquely in the case of the Parthenon marbles, because of course the Parthenon, the decorations on the frieze and the outside, the statues, and all the panel work is designed to be a narrative. It's not the equivalent of Michelangelo's David, for instance, which is very impressive, stands on its own right. However, the Parthenon decorations tell the story of at least part of the Greek peoples. So by separating them and maintaining their separateness, you are by definition cutting off the narrative. So that there's an argument from artistic completeness, I think, which can be made.
Yes, and also one from the Prime Minister himself in a way. So, the Prime Minister of Greece, or Prime Minister, says, my intention is to continue working hard until their final return to the Acropolis Museum. On Wednesday, Greek officials downplayed Prime Minister Boris Johnson's insistence that the issue is a matter for the British Museum to resolve, calling the leader's stance utterly predictable. Mitsotakis is the first Greek Prime Minister to have formally raised the Parthenon marbles at Downing Street. Echoing Mitsotakis' conviction that the campaign should now prioritise UK citizens, the officials instead voiced glee at the reaction of TV viewers to the Greek Prime Minister's plea for the marbles' return on the show Good Morning Britain. The show's anchors later said that the station had been inundated with tweets expressing support for Mitsotakis. And that's interesting to me, partly because I can actually see this as being inevitable. Actually, it seems to me more or less inevitable that they will be returned given the current climate of these cultural debates. But also, Boris Johnson studied classics. I'd be interested to know how he genuinely, personally feels upon reflection about this. I mean,
And he did debate with Mary Beard, didn't he, and took the side of the Greeks against the Romans, I believe,
yes, he
which
did.
is a point on which I would agree with him. The rare those are these days. No, it's a surprise in a sense that it hasn't, given the sort of the rarefied atmosphere of woke that we currently have. That it's actually surprising that we haven't seen the British Museum completely kowtow to any spurious claim on any of their supposedly appropriated artworks and sculptures on the grounds of apologizing for a long sordid history of imperialism. It's almost it's kind of nice actually that the museum is not taking that stance, whereas the rest of the culture would, and also telling, I think, about the state of comparative European cultures. That at the same time as the Greek Prime Minister is coming over to this country, making representations to the Prime Minister and going on Good Morning Britain solely to return statues to his country, which express an important part of its history, we are debating whether we should have statues to our history at all.
Indeed. Apparently, there is a law stating that the British Museum can't give stuff back from 1963. I don't know if it's still in force.
Well, that would have come about at the time of a large number of states and countries declaring their independence from the empire. So you can sort of foresee at the context of the time that there would have been a fear of this influx of claims against the British Museum. So I imagine the government at the time had an interest in well, it took an interest in that area, solely because of the the historical context in which they were then living. I'm still not sure. I mean, I think in a nice, orderly world of reasonable, rational debate, I think a case could be made for discriminating and saying, okay, in the case of the Parthenon marbles, yes, or perhaps there could be, as there are in other cases, sharing arrangements where you could move them back and forth as long as proper care and attention was paid. In their absence, the Greeks have done a sterling job at the Parthenon Museum. There's this whole 3D display showing what the friezes would look like were they complete. So even in their absence, people are able to see as though the thing were complete. But we could share them. We do this with other artworks. We could send them there for a few years, send them back to London for a few years.
Since we already have this, give them back.
Well, I don't know, because we already have this arrangement with. I mean, maybe not. I think the sense of Greek cultural and historical pride in these things might prohibit such an arrangement. But we do have these arrangements in other contexts with other works of art with other countries. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't necessarily at least raise the prospect. But I also think, in a nice, sane, and sensible world, you could say, okay, well, in this particular instance, there are sound moral, cultural, and artistic reasons for returning them, at least part of the time, if not all of the time. But in other cases, there simply aren't. Not all arguments for the returning of artifacts from all countries are equivalently valid. And we ought to be able to say, okay, maybe in the case of the Parthenon marbles, yes. But in the case of someone applying for, something allegedly looted thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago from Uganda, no, or the Sudan. Take care of your country, and then maybe we'll trust you with some of this stuff. But
it would seem that the British Museum Act of 1963 prohibits restitution, only allowing for the disposal of collection items in limited circumstances. So yeah, I think built into the act is a certain degree of discrimination, unless blah 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 the object is unfit or useless for the purposes of the museum. So there is some ambiguity in the text of the law.
There is, which is inevitably why calls are made on the British government to take a stance on this point. If the government takes a stance on their non-return, then it's acceptable, I think, for the Prime Minister of Greece to raise the matter with Boris Johnson. If the government doesn't take a stance on it, though it sounds as though if this law is still on the books, they do. But if the government's position is not to take a stance on this matter and doesn't enact a law either way, and does in fact leave it to the museum, then I don't know. I don't really see the case for involving Boris Johnson other than to apply political pressure, which we already have far too much of in far too many contexts. We have too many politicians invading their opinions on things that ought to be unpolitical.
You could have just stopped at too many politicians.
We have too many politicians. There's an inevitable political angle to all of this, but in an ideal world, the Greek Prime Minister could have this out with the British Museum, and it's not a matter for Boris Johnson to. Given he's got so much else on his plate that he's not dealing with, it's not something that ought to be distracting him.
Is it weird that I have this perverse desire to see the Greek Prime Minister lead a sort of band of Spartans invade the museum and take them by arms all over again?
But it will be so much less impressive, because the Persians could at least amass the Invincibles, that they could amass the undying legions of countless people who would fight and fight and fight, and they'd all die and carry on going. If the Greeks did that to the British state, I'm not entirely sure the British army would be capable of removing them, given that we're sort of following the Americans, being very much more concerned with, shall we say, non-military matters to do with the army, like the representation and inclusivity. So
we'd be resigned to throwing bearskin hats at them.
It would be the ultimate proof, though, that what the argument here is essentially between a country which cares about its history and its culture and a country that doesn't.
Yes.
And if we don't care about ours, I'm not really sure we can have good moral grounds for pretending that we care so much about other people's. Ideally, we care about both, but we don't. So yeah, I don't know. I still lean toward returning them, though I am aware.
I think I do too now.
Though it would not set a legal precedent, I am aware that, practically speaking, I think it probably would set a precedent, and I don't think that would be a very good thing. There are good arguments for other artwork staying in the British Museum, not just that their home countries, their host countries can't actually look after them, but
I think you'd
because
probably find that capital, supply and demand would sort these things out. I mean, if the British
yeah,
Museum seriously thought they would lose a great part of their revenue from visitors or government funding or whatever, then they wouldn't go that far. But
yeah, and then the corollary of that, of course, is that okay, the British Museum will have 10, 100,000 even times the number of visitors being able to see and appreciate and learn about this stuff than if you return some artifact to the National Museum of Nouakchott in Mauritania. So there is the argument about, do you want this to be available to the most people as possible, or do you want it to be returned for the sake of cultural completeness? But again, that sort of differentiates the Greeks from other cases. But yeah, no, I worry that we would be setting a precedent if we accepted this. Nevertheless, I would like to do it up the Greeks.